What is up, friends? Today we are going to explore the exposure triangle. Now I will keep it as fast and as crisp as I can. The topic is huge, so I will point out the important things only that you need to understand before you dip your feet into this immense ocean of photography. Now, what is exposure triangle? The darkness or the brightness in a photo. To put it more clearly, it is the amount of light that hits the sensor. Why do we care? Because image is formed when the light hits the sensor. So if you have an image which is a little too dark or a little too bright, your exposure is messed up. And we study exposure triangle to control this flow of light into the sensor. Now there are three corners of the triangle: the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture, which are interdependent on each other. Hence the term triangle. Two of these, the aperture and the shutter speed, are directly in control of the amount of light that enters into your camera and hits the sensor. Now let's talk about aperture. There are two things that you need to understand. Aperture is the property of the lens because it is the opening inside the lens that allows the light to enter into the camera and fall on the sensor. The second, bigger the aperture, more the light will enter. Smaller the aperture, less the light will enter. How to change the size of the aperture? Now there is something marked as f number in the camera. Smaller the f number, bigger is the size of the aperture. Larger the f number, smaller is the size of the aperture. Which means f2.8 will allow more light into the camera than f4. So if you want more light, you guessed it right. Keep your f number as lowest as you can, which will give you the widest aperture. Now how do we know the maximum size of the aperture in the lens? The f number is always mentioned with the name of the lens. For example, 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6. This means that this lens on a focal length of 100 mm, the widest aperture will be 4.5, f4.5. And on 400, the widest aperture that you can use is 5.6. As simple as that. Now, what are the implications? Besides controlling the light, there is another very important effect of aperture on your images. The wider your aperture is, the more blur, more bokeh will be there in the background. If the f number is higher, everything will be relatively more sharper. So you want more blur, keep the f number as low as possible because f number and size of the aperture are inversely proportional. So if you want something like this, the aperture has to be widest. However, if you want something like this, the aperture needs to be smaller. There are a couple of other factors that affect the depth of field too, but let's just keep it for some other video. Now let's talk about shutter speed. In every camera, there is a shutter in front of the sensor. So shutter speed is basically the duration of time your shutter takes to open and close. More the time it will take, more light will fall on the sensor. Less the time it will take, less light will fall on the sensor. So if you want more light, your shutter has to be somewhere around 1/60, 50, whatever, suiting on the situation. Right? If you want to capture action, your shutter speed has to be on a higher range. Now the range of shutter speed for your camera will be mentioned in the specification. This will help you mention the fastest and the slowest shutter your camera can afford to reach. Of course, 1 second is slower than 1/100th of a second, elementary mathematics. Now let's look at the implications of shutter speed. Shutter speed helps you to capture the motion or freeze the action. Now if you want to freeze a fast movement, you need a faster shutter speed. If the subject is moving and your shutter speed is slow, there will be a lot of motion blur in the photo or camera shake, which of course will mess up your images to a great extent. Now let's say if you want to shoot a flying bird, you need a shutter anywhere above 1/500. If you want a still bird, a shutter speed of even 1/100 is enough, depending on how still the bird is and depending on how still you are. Now you would think, why not keep it on the above range and why just risk of keeping it on a lower range and risk the blur? Two reasons. Lighting is not always in our hands, especially in wildlife. There are times wherein you will simply cannot be able to afford that much of a shutter speed because lighting is simply not enough. If light is less, your camera will not be able to click anything on a faster shutter speed because camera is a light soaking box. Now light is less and you further reduce the flow of light with a faster shutter speed, your image will be dark. Now to make up for this shortage of light, you have to draw light from other source. Which other source? Aperture. Well, the problem with aperture is that you've already opened it the widest. You cannot open it further. If you're on a 50 mm f1.8 and your aperture is already 1.8, then what? You cannot open it further. So what is left? ISO. Now ISO is not a controller of light. It is simply the sensitivity of your sensor towards light. More sensitive the sensor, more louder it will react to light. So a brighter image. Less sensitive the sensor, subtle will be the reaction. So a nicely exposed, soft, clean image. Now you would say, why not keep it super sensitive and make it more reactive towards light? By this we can have ample light and keep our aperture and shutter speed as per our own requirements. Well, that is because higher levels of ISO come with higher levels of noise. Not the noise we hear, the noise we see. Look here. Little disturbance that you see in the background when I zoom into the photograph is called the noise. Now, if there is a lot of noise, you will also tend to lose a lot of detail. So, you will have to be very, very vigilant about how much levels of ISO your camera can comfortably take. If your camera specifications say around 100 to 12800, this doesn't mean that your camera can comfortably go on 12800 and give you cleaner images. To find out the threshold that is acceptable to you, I have a small exercise. For this, pick up your camera and click 10 images on every stop of ISO. Import it in the computer, zoom in and study the images. Find that appropriate level of ISO on which you can get an acceptable result, and when you are in the field, make sure that you never cross that threshold.